Yep, all set. Hey, everybody, and welcome to another edition of Talking Hockey Sense. I'm Chris Peters. This is episode 95 of the podcast, and we are so excited to have you here and so much to get to today. We are going to talk about the ECHL season opener. You can watch it all on FloHockey. If you haven't yet, subscribe today. There's not just the ECHL, but all the other great hockey that you can find on FloHockey. We've had some great college games, some really good junior games as well. But we're getting ready to start the professional season with both the ECHL and the SPHL on FloHockey this year. And it all gets underway on Thursday, October 19th. And really excited to have a guest that's going to help us today to preview this ECHL season. And he's really one of the premier voices on the ECHL. You can read his work at the Journal Gazette in Fort Wayne. You can also read him on FloHockey now as our featured columnist for the ECHL, and you can also listen to him on THN on the E in podcast form, which is a great way to keep up with the league. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to introduce Justin Cohn to the Talking Hockey Sense audience. And Justin, welcome to the program, and thanks for joining us this week.
Absolutely. Appreciate you having me, Chris.
All right. Well, for those that don't know yet, Justin has been churning out some incredible preseason content for us on FloHockey. Every single team is hit. Tons of notes, tons of nuggets of news that will help you prepare. If you haven't caught up with all the transactions, well, good luck doing that anyway. That's how things go in the ECHL. We do the best we can to keep them up to date, but that's the way things go. The rosters are going to change, but we are really excited to have the opening night coming your way on FloHockey. So before I get into the season preview, Justin, you've been covering the ECHL for quite a long time and have seen it all. You're in Fort Wayne, which is one of the oldest professional hockey markets in the country. And so before we get started, I wanted to ask you, what's the best part about covering the ECHL? What is the thing you enjoy most about covering this league? Because as far as I can tell, it's ever changing and always interesting, and there's really never no day is the same. So, but what do you enjoy most about covering this league?
Well, I grew up in the Detroit area, and of course, we were Red Wing fans, and all my friends and family are NHL fans. So they do have kind of a difficult time understanding maybe the charm of covering the minor leagues. So, it's just different. There's different buildings, there's different expectations about what you're going to see. In Fort Wayne, they want winning hockey. They want cups, they want championships, they want fights, they want all those things that we associate with minor league hockey. And then, you know, Fort Wayne's been in the league since 2012, and now they finally have started to see this is a developmental league too.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a long-winded answer to what you're asking, but it's a whole mix of things. Are we seeing future stars? What are they like at this level as they're still trying to learn the game and understand the playing 3 games in 3 nights, stuff that they didn't have to do in college or wherever they came from, and mix that with all of the things that you get with minor league hockey. I mean, there are just sometimes something ridiculous will happen that just doesn't happen at the NHL level. Whether it is, some happening on a bus ride, or, you've got some travel delay and you're having to somehow hike it, 1,200 miles just to get to some playoff game, or something happens in the stands, and some of these things, when you're going through it as a reporter, they're like hard to digest and they're very difficult to report. But then you just kind of sit back a week later and you're just kind of like laughing about it. Like, I can't believe that happened. And then to get back to what I'm saying, then I'll call up my father or my brother and try to explain it to them, and they don't really get it because they're not, they're NHL people. So I don't know if that answers it, but there's just so much kooky stuff that goes on, and there is great opportunities for storytelling and watching future prospects too.
Yeah, I mean, such a great cast of characters in the ECHL. Lots of different personalities, lots of coaches that have you've got the grizzled coach that's been just, going at every different level for 20 years, and you've got all these other things that are just crazy. But you also have at the heart of it professional hockey. And if you've never been to an ECHL game, first of all, they're very fun. They're a lot of fun. There's a lot of excitement. Is it the NHL? No, it's not supposed to be. And that's kind of the fun of it, is that you are going to see different things throughout the year. Now Fort Wayne, where you're based, is really kind of ground zero for professional hockey in the Midwest. You look at different things in terms of, especially at the minor league level. The Fort Wayne Comets have existed for 70 plus years. In various leagues, the IHL, the CHL, the ECHL, so many different levels. But I did want to ask you, what's it like covering such a historic franchise where you say, there's an expectation level from the fans that they're competing for championships. There's definitely a feeling around that the Fort Wayne Comets are very much a part of not just Fort Wayne, but just that entire area in terms of the whole hockey market. I mean, most of the youth hockey organizations around there, can kind of trace their roots back to the Fort Wayne Comets, and they've had legendary broadcasters, they've had legendary players. But what's it been like for you now in a modern era of the league to cover such a historic team?
I mean, I say this, and I'm not trying to pump my own tires here, but I feel like this answers the question. We cover it like an NHL team. I mean,
Yeah.
we'll have stories almost daily. If I'm not at the road game, then we're figuring out a way to cover it remotely. So that goes back to 72 years of history. It goes back to just the interest in this team. And, I just haven't seen another team, certainly at the AA level, that gets covered the way Fort Wayne does. So it's sort of a unique market in that respect. I mean, this is my 27th season. I haven't missed a playoff game. And in that time, they've only missed the playoffs twice. So, I guess find another market where it gets that sort of coverage. I'd be interested to hear it. So it is very unique.
Right.
The expectations are incredibly high every year with the fans. I mean, if they're not competing for a championship, I mean, they're just going to jump off cliffs here. So it's just a very different market. And, you said it's ground zero. I'm sure people in Toledo, Ohio would argue with that. But that's just the way it feels here, so 10 championships, 5 different leagues. I mean, it's just an anomaly to me here.
Yeah. And no disrespect to Toledo, because it's been a tremendous hockey market, and they've gone through a lot of different teams. It just seems like the Comets as a franchise have been the mainstay, whereas Toledo has certainly had, the Storm, the Gold Diggers, unreal name, the Walleye now. And you look at those two markets and they're so dedicated. And to your point, covering it like an NHL team means that there has to be that level of interest in it. And there's no question that that's the case in Fort Wayne. You look at, those games between Fort Wayne and Toledo, often games that we'll see, huge spikes and watching people, just seeing all these games, and we'll get a lot more interaction from those fan bases. They really do care. And, and I think that it's starting to grow in a lot of other markets. Now, as we head into this season, there's a lot of great storylines across the ECHL. I mean, there's certainly, we've got some kind of unique situations with the way players are being sent down. Every single year, we usually will have one of the top goaltending prospects in hockey in the ECHL over the course of a season. Or, we have guys like Ryan Fanti last year was an undrafted free agent, just getting his feet wet in pro hockey. And he had a very eventful season last year, which was a lot of fun, I'm sure, for you to cover, because it was fun for us to share some of the hijinks from his season. But we also are seeing a team in the Florida Everblades that are coming into the season as the 2-time defending champion with nobody's ever three-peated on the Kelly Cup, at least. And so they've got a really interesting opportunity in front of them as a franchise. Last year, it was both the Florida Panthers, their NHL affiliate, and themselves in their championship series, with Florida the Panthers falling just short of the Stanley Cup, but Florida wins their second straight Kelly Cup. And you recently had a chance to kind of take a look at their recipe for success. And I just wonder, based on what you've seen and what you've heard from the coaching staff, and just kind of observing as an interested observer in the ECHL, what it is that does make a team like them so successful.
Well, I mean, there's a recipe to success that sounds pretty easy, but for very few people have been able to pull it off. First of all, you have to have good coaching. Brad Ralph is the coach there. He's been tearing up the record books, especially when it comes to playoffs. He's generally regarded to be the best coach in the league. And I think when I say that, it's on a number of levels. It's not just X's and O's, but it's his rapport with the players. I mean, people want to go play for the Everblades. They obviously have a good relationship with their NHL, AHL affiliates, the Panthers and Charlotte. And good relationship means to me not just you're getting players, but you know when you're getting them and potentially how long you're going to have them for. So, I'm in Fort Wayne right now. They've got 11 contracted guys. I don't know that we know how long they're going to be here. They could get called up in 2 weeks or 2 months. But when you're a coach and, in Fort Wayne, like he's got to have a good idea. Okay, if I cut a bunch of great guys that I went and recruited, am I going to regret this in 2 weeks because I'm going to be looking for free agents? So in Florida, I feel like there's a good communication. He knows, okay, we've got 2 really good goalies on AHL contracts, Cam Johnson, Evan Cormier. Can I rely on one or both these guys being here for any length of time? So if you have that good relationship, it allows you to build a competent roster. And then beyond that, they've had a nucleus of returning guys. The last couple of years, it was guys like Levko Koper and Blake Winicky. So if you have 5, 6 guys who've been around, they want to win because they're getting later in their careers, and they help drive the ship, and they help keep everybody in line, and they get the coach's message so that they aren't tuning out that coach's message, because if you hear the same thing every day, you eventually tune it out. I think those are the big keys to the success of Florida over the last couple of years. And if you look at them this year, it seems to be more of the same. Some of that nucleus of the older guys, maybe the names have changed, but they've still got it. And then the one thing that's maybe a work in progress, and Brad Ralph will tell you this, is the defensive courts. It's a little bit younger, new faces. Maybe that's the thing where there's going to have to be some more teaching and a bit of a learning curve this year. But, that's the recipe in Florida. Sounds easy enough, but we see very few teams, pull that off year after year.
Yeah, no question about it. And I mean, one of the amazing things about Brad Ralph too is, it feels like he's been around forever. It feels like he's been in the pro coaching, and he started in the SPHL as a head coach back in 2010. He's only 43 years old, and he's already got these 2 titles, and he's not a name that we hear a ton about, moving up the ranks, but with the level of success that he's had, you'd have to think that there's got to be some potential for him to move on, just because of the amount of success that he's had, the culture that they've built in Florida, and they just don't accept anything less than a maximum effort. And you look at last year too, going into the playoffs, not as that they weren't the favorites. They certainly had the experience, they certainly had the goaltending, and then Cam Johnson certainly shut the door for him and did it again. And to know that he's at least back in the interim, and you never know if he'll get called up to the AHL, but if he is, that's a guy that could potentially, you could ride all the way to another Kelly Cup. So if they're able to do it, that's going to be one of the big storylines of the entire season, is watching that team. And certainly Brad Ralph will be there. Justin wrote a great story and a kind of details some of this recipe. You'll be able to see that on FloHockey ahead of opening day here. So the other thing that I think is interesting coming into this season is, last year we had the Idaho Steelheads, which was a historic team in terms of the amount of wins that they piled up. Most wins, most points. I mean, regular season champions. They make it to the final, lose to Florida in the final. They'll be looking to bounce back. A ton of guys from that team are back. They have a few key losses that will certainly impact them. But in addition to Idaho and Florida, who are some of the teams that you've kind of got your eye on that could potentially make some noise this year? It's always difficult to predict at this time of year because of the amount of roster turnover that we could see over the course of a season. And if you think, NHL general managers have a tough job, I don't know if there's anybody on planet Earth that has as tough a job as an ECHL head coach, who's also typically the general manager of the team. There are usually upwards of 70 transactions over the course of sometimes it feels like a month, but usually over the course of a season. Sometimes more, sometimes it's in the hundreds. But just knowing that, who are some of the teams, at least in the initial look, as you kind of were putting your preseason content together, that you think have a chance to really step up this year?
Well, the Jacksonville Icemen are a team I like a lot. Like you go up and down their lineup. Just a lot of nice players. On defense, they've got toughness, guys like Jack Van Boekel. On the forward line it's sort of an embarrassment of riches to me. Easton Brodzinski, Matheson Nakapelli, Derek Lodemeyer, Christopher Brown. I mean, they're really stacked and check all the boxes, whether it's toughness, whether it's goaltending. They got Mike Vernon's kid, Matt Vernon. So I like that roster. That whole South Division, though, it's going to be a gauntlet. I mean, so many good teams there, whether it's South Carolina, Greenville. I feel like Savannah is, now that they've had a year under their belt, they're going to be a lot better. But other teams, Allen, I am shocked they were able to bring back as many guys as they brought back last year. Now, you talked about Idaho. Idaho was very much, to me, driven by the defense. Yes. Allen was like the opposite, driven by the offense, and they're in the same division. And they lost Hank Crone, who was maybe the best player in the league last year, but they brought back a bunch of guys that really helped drive that offense. Liam Finley, Colton Hargrove, those are just a couple guys. And, they just got Matt Marcineau. I feel like they did make some improvements on the defense. So they're kind of an X factor out there that I like. And then the Cincinnati Cyclones brought back a bevy of players from last year from the team that won the division championship. Zach Andrusiak, Justin Vive, Louis Caparuso, Jalen Smerek. So they look really stacked too. But that whole division is going to be really tough because we're not sure. Toledo's got a lot of guys back, but they've got a new coach. Fort Wayne's got a new coach, but on paper, they look like a behemoth. Indy has been on the upswing. I think Kalamazoo might end up being the most improved team in the league. So that whole division's a gauntlet too. But to sum it up, I'd say keep an eye on Allen, keep an eye on Cincinnati, and really keep an eye on Jacksonville. And then if you want another team that might be sneaky good, I'd say the Adirondack Thunder.
Yeah, Adirondack was party to one of the most thrilling days of hockey you could possibly imagine. They came down to the last day of the season. They needed, at least 1 point to advance to the playoffs. And the team that they were playing ended up pulling their goalie with the game tied because they needed 2 points to get into the playoffs. And an overtime win was not going to cut it. They pull the goalie, Adirondack scores. They get the last spot into the playoffs. And then, unfortunately for them, run into was it Newfoundland that knocked them right out. So, but right. Adirondack's going to be really interesting. And we'll also, one team that I think is also going to be interesting that I wanted to bring up just because it's a different scenario. The Norfolk Admirals were among the last place teams in the league last year. They really struggled throughout the entire season. There's been a lot of talk about the Carolina Hurricanes and how they aren't going to have an AHL team this year. That they had a falling out with the Chicago Wolves. The Chicago Wolves are going independent, and that's actually where Hank Crone is right now. He's with the Chicago Wolves, the MVP of the ECHL last year. Gets an opportunity with an unaffiliated team. And Norfolk is now going to have potentially, we're still waiting to find out exactly who's all going to be there, but Carolina has sent some NHL contracted players to Norfolk in an agreement with, they don't have a set ECHL affiliate, but they did secure an agreement to send players to Norfolk. And so that's going to be a very interesting kind of dynamic. I think like Dom Fensori is one of the players that was sent down there. He signed last season out of Boston University. There's going to be a couple of other guys that are down in the in that team. But how that dynamic works, we'll have to wait and see. But that is another team. And then also a couple of the teams that you mentioned, Cincy and Jacksonville, flopped NHL affiliates. With Jacksonville getting the Buffalo and now Cincinnati getting New York, the Rangers. So there's kind of that little interesting dynamic there. And both of those teams actually did send a fair amount of guys to their respective ECHL teams. So always interesting to see. But Buffalo in particular has been typically sent quite a few guys down to the ECHL. And how does that help Jacksonville in the end. So really great stuff there. I
Can
think
I
there's
can I
there's
say
a lot.
something on can I say
Please
something on
do.
Norfolk? Yeah.
Yeah, I'd
So
love to. Yeah.
I mean, look, Norfolk's been in the cellar for seemingly forever.
Yeah.
And even before all this affiliation stuff, I kind of liked the direction they were going because they were not that bad like the second half of last season.
Right.
And you can tell that they were like, okay, we're going to figure out what we like here. We're going to bring those guys back. And then they get I believe it's Winnipeg affiliation.
Hmm.
So theoretically, they're going to get guys from there. And I went through something not totally dissimilar from this, where I was dealing with a team that had two, like one affiliate, it was Vegas. And then there was a secondary, which was Los Angeles. And in my experience covering that, like it was sort of nice because you obviously get more players, but where it got interesting was with the goalies because theoretically you're always going to have at least one contracted goalie. And in that case, maybe they have two. And then you've got the NHL teams kind of saying, well, we want our guy playing more often. So that's kind of the one thing that I would really keep an eye on is do they have two goalies? Who's getting the most playing time? And oftentimes, coaches always say, oh, it's not a big deal because you're playing 3-3 every weekend in this league anyway. So it's not like guy's not going to be playing forever. But I'd say that's one thing to really watch is the goaltending there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's just it can be a bit of a unique dynamic, and certainly it's not unprecedented for teams to have multiple affiliates or have agreements with teams that will send players there, I'm fascinated to see how it all plays out. But as you mentioned too, Norfolk was awful at the beginning of the season, and then really did come on in the second half last year. They'll have a lot of new faces, and it'll be interesting to see. A lot of there was quite a bit of shuffling of affiliates this year. Nashville was with Norfolk last year. Now they're with Atlanta. So there's all sorts of fun stuff that happens with that. But, before we, get to kind of some other topics that I wanted to talk a little bit about, the ECHL at its core is a developmental league. They're developing players for certain steps. And we've seen actually a number of NHL teams start to more aggressively use their ECHL team, and one such team is Toronto, and that was more under Kyle Dubas, who is now with Pittsburgh, and Pittsburgh has often had quite a few contracted players that end up playing for the Wheeling Nailers, which has been a longtime affiliate for them as well. But we saw it with Newfoundland. They won their championship in the first year of their existence. They opted out of the pandemic year, but otherwise they've always made the playoffs, and often with a number of Maple Leafs prospects on there. Do you think, having seen the success of Newfoundland and how that has also translated, the Marlies went on a deep playoff run last year as well in the AHL. Do you think that maybe the ECHL has been underutilized in the past, and as we see more like this, there's potential for better prospects to come down and get some experience in the ECHL?
I mean, there's no doubt it hasn't been utilized enough. If the goal is to someday, and I've got my own issues with this, but if the goal is to get to something closer to baseball, a true three-tiered system, then yeah, why would you not have as many guys as you can get? Just let's stash them in Double A and see if they pan out. So I think you're seeing more of that now. I mean, it is really like the recipe to success now is you have a younger team of developmental players, and the whole league is just trending younger than it was 10 years ago, where everybody still had that nucleus of minor league lifers, if you will, the 28 to 32-year-old guys. I mean, now you see teams, they're like, oh, we don't even need to have the maximum of 4 veterans. Like, we don't even care about that. We'll throw a captaincy on a kid that's 23. So yeah, I think teams are starting to embrace that more. And that starts at the NHL level with deciding, okay, we're going to pay some money. We'll have a more expansive minor league system. We'll put guys in the Double A level. But then you see other teams like St. Louis, which has just never been a big believer in having a Double A affiliate, kind of sitting out there and like, well, what do we need to do that for? So, I don't know. You can argue at both sides. I mean,
Right.
there were 74 former ECHL players on NHL opening night rosters. Most of those guys, if you really look at it, though, they only had a cup of coffee in the ECHL level.
Right.
So I don't know. You could spin that either direction and say, well, look, obviously we're developing players, but you could spin it the other direction and say, yeah, but are you? So from a building the team perspective, of course, when you're at this level, you want as many contracted guys as you can get, because it saves you, it relieves your salary cap burden. That's a huge reason. It gets
For
you more
sure.
talent. You're not having to do the recruiting work and all that. But coaches, of course, they lose the ability to manage their roster some when they do that. So again, the Fort
Correct.
Wayne example, they've got 11 guys right now. We're not used to that number, and it's a mix of excitement and nervousness because you just don't know what's going to happen because of that. But to use your example, Newfoundland and the Maple Leafs, yeah, I think that's becoming a little bit more of the way. I don't think it'll become totally that way where you just kind of hand over the reins until the NHL teams start buying the ECHL teams. And that's where it could get a little dicier.
Great point. The most, if not all ECHL teams are independently owned. In terms of, these are in a lot of cases local businesses. These are, or they're conglomerates that have ownership just in that specific team, and the bottom line is tickets. The bottom line is ad revenue. It's all these different things. What I will say, and we're going to get into ownership in just a second, because something real interesting has been happening in the league the last little bit here. But one of the things that I think is important as well is that the ECHL has now become a proven developmental path for goalies. Stuart Skinner was an NHL All-Star last year. He played some time in the ECHL. The Detroit Red Wings had Sebastian Cossa, their goalie of the future, in Toledo for the entire season, which was very beneficial to him. And then even they still were able to. They ended up signing John Leatherman to an AHL contract as well, or an NHL contract, and now they've really kind of built that pipeline. Ukko-Pekka Luukkonen's another guy who played when Buffalo was with Cincinnati, and we're going to continue to see that. Yeah, Yuri Patera is. I just saw him in an AHL game. He was with you guys in Fort Wayne not all that long ago, and with that team, and so yeah. So I think that, for me personally, I think one of the things that NHL teams have to get over, and I think the players have to get over as well, is sometimes there is that stigma. There's this kind of, I'm not going down. That's it for me. I'm not going down there. But when in the fact of the matter is you can still learn to be a pro. And in fact, you can almost learn better because you're going to be put in better situations than you might have been in the AHL level. And so I think, and I do think that tiered system, more similar to baseball, those guys that come straight from junior, that jump to the AHL is huge. It's same for the guys from college, and just getting into a rhythm of learning how to be a pro, learning how to prepare, having some veteran players on your team that can kind of take you under your wing. I think there's a tremendous amount of value in that opportunity. So, but I did want to talk about this very interesting development across the ECHL in the last little bit. There have been some ownership shuffling, and there's also an expansion team coming in Lake Tahoe. And I don't know if you can get a transfer out of Fort Wayne to Lake Tahoe for the coverage there, but I think people will be clamoring for that one. But Tim Tebow is going to be part of that ownership group. And then we also saw Miles Jack become the former Jacksonville Jaguar, an NFL player who retired like 6 weeks prior from the NFL, become the majority owner of the Allen American. So now we're starting to see this kind of celebrity element coming into the ECHL from an ownership perspective. There are ties between both of those situations, and also with a couple of other ECHL teams. But I mean, it is pretty interesting to see. You're starting to see these big name investors buying into the ECHL. What do you make of it?
Yeah, I don't know what to make of it because I don't know how much of a role they end up having in the day to day. That's the thing. Like, there's always this big splash. Um, when you get, I think it was PK Subban was one. And you make a big announcement. So like Tim Tebow, let's use that. Hey, that's great. That gets you huge national news. But I don't know, is he going to have anything to do with the team beyond that? I hope so. So, I think it's good publicity for the league, but I don't know how often I've actually sat there and seen, like, on social media, for instance, these these former pro athletes really trumpeting what's going on with their team in the ECHL. Maybe it's happening and I'm missing it. So I would like to see a little bit more, at least public involvement if we're going to have these big names, because the league could certainly use the exposure. But in a general sense, the ownership, because I do get asked this a lot. Boy, should I be concerned with all these teams changing hands? I think actually what we've seen has been pretty good, because as you mentioned, they are small businesses and you want to make sure that they are on great footing, and the pandemic hammered people. So, there are teams, look at Newfoundland, Trois Rivières. I mean, that whole situation totally changed in the pandemic. And then there was other things going on, but the pandemic, I mean, the travel costs, that was one thing. Like that was before it was supposed to be, Newfoundland was going to help alleviate the travel costs. But then the pandemic happens and you come out of it and they're like, all right, we need some help from the league on this whole thing. So in a general sense, a bunch of ownership changes usually makes me nervous, because I've covered so many leagues that folded or got absorbed. But in this particular case, I think we're seeing strengthening of the teams, finding people in those markets that are going to be more invested. And that's overall a good thing. But as for the celebrity aspect of it, I don't know.
Yeah. It only matters if they make it matter, right? So, and I think that's a really good point too. I do think that the league is certainly in a position of strength. We saw that, in their summer meetings, they did increase the number of potential expansion markets, that the limit has been lifted, essentially not lifted. But it's been raised so that it's more in line. There are fewer ECHL teams than there are AHL and NHL teams, which is why we start seeing some of these doubling ups and different things. So very fascinating. But, when you see it, Miles Jack is, the first Black owner in the ECHL. And that's a very interesting thing. A majority owner. Anson Carter has a piece of the Atlanta Gladiators. Now you've got Tebow. There's all these different kind of little connections that help. And I think, there's also a connection. All those guys are kind of Florida, Jacksonville adjacent. And that the Zoyer Sports and Entertainment, which is actually going to be doing a lot of the operational work for that team, is Jacksonville based. So, I do think that that's going to be interesting to kind of watch and see how there is, if there is much involvement in different things. But I'll tell you what, go ahead. Sorry, Justin.
Well, I was going to say, just two quick points. So, first of all, it's incredible that it had been almost 20 years since the first African-American owner of a hockey team. That was Herb Washington in the Central Hockey League. So it's incredible it's been that long. So yes, that's very much a positive thing. But you're mentioning the expansion, and just, sometimes it does make me a little bit nervous. Like, Lake Tahoe's there, but who are they going to play? Because everybody keeps telling us Utah is going to be in the NHL someday. And, we got Trois Rivières and Newfoundland kind of off on an island. And I just wanted to bring it up because I covered the original IHL. And what killed the original IHL was it became a nationwide league. And it was a bit more than that. It became big markets. So, a city like Fort Wayne it's funny we say this, but at the time it was like, oh no, we're going to be competing with Orlando, so here we are. But it became big markets. It had been like Dayton, and then it becomes, like Cleveland and Detroit, the Detroit Vipers, and they were spending tons of money. But one big thing was it became a nationwide league, and the travel costs became unbearable. And then, they try to keep the travel costs in line here, but you're still making at least one, probably two, long trips during the regular season where you have to fly instead of bus. And then in the playoffs, all bets are off. So if you are Allen, let's just say, let's think about that for a second. You're Allen. You could have to play Idaho in the first round. Oh, okay, that's not bad. Tulsa in the second round. Okay, it's not that bad. But then all of a sudden you're going to Toledo, a little bit farther. And then what if you have to play like Newfoundland in the finals? The travel can get crazy. And so when we're spitting out all these other markets, it's nice to have the numbers aligned with the NHL. But these are small businesses, and you have to remember that part too. And I'm not always sure they've learned the lessons of the leagues that have died.
Yeah, we'll have to see, because I think that this will be, It is interesting to kind of watch it unfold, here and seeing how how the league grows. And obviously, this league is much more divisional based as well. There's a lot more, but you're right. Once you get to the playoffs, it's a whole different story.
I mean, in
And
baseball, you're
yeah,
playing your whole playoff, within your
with
division, within your region.
yeah,
You're not
yeah,
now adding on a whole playoff where you're going across the country. Like
right,
Fort Wayne
right,
isn't going
right.
to have to play Lake Elsinore in the playoffs. So that is a difference between
Yeah,
baseball and hockey. They need to be
yeah.
careful with.
Yeah, so it'll be interesting to watch and certainly that. But before I get you out of here, the ECHL we talked about, great characters, great, you've talked about some of the kookier things that have happened. I want, your dealer's choice here. I'm going to say, what is either the most memorable or the craziest story that you've covered in your time covering the ECHL? And they may not be the same thing, but you let me know what you want to dive in on
Well,
here.
do they have to be positive? That's the big question.
Well, I dealer's
You,
choice.
you, I mean, I'm just gonna say the first thing that jumps to mind, and maybe it's just because it's in recent history, but in the playoffs last year, there was the hotel, the bed bugs incident.
Oh
That
gosh.
kind of jumps out. So that's one thing where in traveling at this level, I don't know if you want me to tell the whole story, but traveling at this level, it can be interesting. And there was a team that ended up, with a not great travel situation, and they ended up sleeping at the arena. And that was like a story that I'm hearing at like 3 a.m. It's not even a team I cover. So, that was a
Right.
very ECHL moment. But, more positively, gosh, there's a lot. I covered a cup in 2021, and the things Fort Wayne went through just to play that season, and the travel. I wish I remember the number. It was like 12,000 miles that they had to travel
Wow.
just in the playoffs, and just to pull off these games. They played a game in the practice arena in Wichita, and there was no glass in some sections, and the puck could actually hit the ceiling. If they were trying to do a high dump. I mean, that was craziness. And then in the finals, again, they had to play in a practice arena in South Carolina because they were filming the Righteous Gemstones at the Charleston Coliseum. So, I mean, like that, stuff like, this doesn't happen in the NHL. And then, Fort Wayne's, they're busing to Allen, yet they flew Dylan Ferguson down there because they wanted him to be more comfortable. And then he gets down there and then he loses the first game, and just wild stuff during that whole run. And then just one last thing. I mean, just this is sort of in between, wildly positive and negative. Sean Sidlowski and AJ Jenks. That is one of the memorable stories for me, where Sidlowski was Fort Wayne's best player, and they go play in Toledo, the biggest rivalry, and Jenks with a knee-on-knee hit blows out his knee. And then they don't meet again until the next season. And then Sidlowski and Jenks fight because, of course, they're both old school players, so they fight. And then 2 years later, Jenks comes and joins Fort Wayne, and they're now teammates. And then I do this big story, and I come to find out that not only that, they were good friends like when they were kids. And your friends, your teammates as kids, your hated enemies in the pros. One of them breaks your knee, you end up fighting, then you join the same team, you hug it out, and then win a championship together. I mean, like stuff like that is kind of wild
Yeah.
too. So, all
Yeah.
kinds of funny stuff, and that's just for the last couple of years.
Yeah, hockey, and certainly at the professional level, and it creates these very unique circumstances. But in the end, I think a lot of these guys, they put it all out there on the ice, and then they leave it on the ice, and then all of a sudden it's back to the good times. But yeah, I mean, Fort Wayne is certainly one of the more unique franchises, and I'm sure it's just a blast to cover this league. And we're excited to have you here at FloHockey doing some several stories a month for us and power rankings, and it's going to be a lot of fun for us to have you and to get your musings on the league, because there's no shortage of stories to tell and things to write about. So Justin Cohn, thanks very much. You can follow him at Sports Cohn on Twitter, and then also make sure you're checking out all of his work at the Journal Gazette, at the THN on the E podcast, and now on FloHockey. Justin Cohn, thanks so much for joining us on Talking Hockey Sense.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
All right. Well, there goes Justin, and we're so thankful for him to hop on with us. A very busy man this time of year as we get set for the ECHL season, and I can't wait to do it. But yeah, I mean, some of the great stories around the league. We're excited to find out just how much how different this year is going to be from the last. You never really know until the things get going, and we'll get there. But just really quickly wanted to share some few prospect thoughts because we are typically a prospect podcast and wanted to do that. So there's a couple of interesting stories going on right now in the prospect world. And one that's probably caught the most attention right now is the NHL's potential proposal to decentralize the NHL draft, which is to say the teams will stay at a home base or a war room somewhere. The players and media and everybody else will be at a draft. And I've heard a lot of mixed reviews. I've talked to scouts that like the idea, that hate the idea. I think that general managers, there's been a lot made about the fact that general managers go basically from NHL awards to NHL draft to free agency immediately. And that's just the way it's set up. It's a very compressed schedule. It's very difficult to kind of get everything together. Here's my thing. I think the NHL draft is one of the best drafts there is, especially the first round. I think the bringing the jersey, shaking the commissioner's hand, and then going with your new team, shaking the general manager's hand, the owner, the scouts that were out there. One of the big moments for a scout in their career is their team is making a first round pick. They're picking the player that he recommended. He's among the people that goes up onto the staff. He or she is among the people that goes up onto the dais and is able to have that moment. And I've heard many describe that as such a big part of their career and such a memorable time when you go up there and it's an area scout and you've recommended this player and they say, hey, you're part of the group coming up on stage with us. We want you to be part of it. And then, you get this magical moment in your career and all that hard work that you've put in, all the time on the road, you now have that moment. Doesn't always happen, by the way. Not everybody brings up their entire, some teams will bring up almost the entire scouting staff. Some will bring up, a couple of guys. But it's usually a tell. If you ever wanted to kind of handicap who the pick might be, take a look. If you know who your area scouts are, take a look and see if they're heading up to the stage. But maybe that won't be possible anymore. And I personally think that the NHL, that's an event that the NHL gets very, very right. And it's not something that we often say about the NHL in terms of, the various things that they do. Obviously, things like Winter Classic, All-Star Game, they do the big events really well. And I think the draft is one of those things. And the change can be fine. I think, it'll be up to the owners in the end. But I do think that what the draft does in the NHL is unique to the NHL. And I don't think they should be going to rush to try to be football or baseball or any of those sports with the draft. Another prospect note that I wanted to share, Dalibor Dvorsky, first round pick of the St. Louis Blues, is leaving Sweden, and he will be joining the OHL's Sudbury Wolves. So the Sudbury Wolves they've got a really good team. They've got a team that's going to contend for the OHL title this year. They've got a number of first round draft picks on their roster. They have some good young players, and now they're adding Dalibor Dvorsky. I believe they're going to have to make another corresponding move because they're already at their import limit. So they'll have to bring him in. But basically what happened, Dvorsky's ice time fluctuated a lot with IK Oscarsson. I can never say it. I know a lot of the Swedish names, but I can't do it. I usually say Oxsharman, which is not true. That's not how you say it. But anyway, it's probably way easier than I'm making it out to be. But was playing in the SHL this year. He had played last season in the Allsvenskan second division. Wasn't getting great ice time. I think it was like a -6 or so. And then in his last two games, he played like two shifts and one shift, and it's not a good situation. So the team agreed to terminate his contract and his loan agreement. That allows the St. Louis Blues, who did sign him to an entry-level contract, to decide where he goes. Sudbury owns his rights, so he is going to Sudbury. We know that already. He is a tremendous talent. I don't think that this changes that. There are some players that aren't going to adjust to the environment, the coaching, the pro level. He had a great season in the Allsvenskan last year. Now he's moving on. The SHL didn't work out. Now he's going to play among his age peers, and I fully expect him to gain a lot of confidence after the initial adjustment period. But I think playing in North America is a good thing. The other thing, too, is since he wasn't drafted out of the CHL, he will be able to be sent to the AHL next season. So definitely looking forward to that there and seeing, ultimately what he does this year in the OHL. But we fully expect Dvorsky to be a big player throughout the rest of the season. He'll play in the World Juniors. He'll get other opportunities. But that is one thing that is changed at this point. So very intrigued by a couple of those happenings, and then we'll of course continue to talk about much more prospect news in our Q&A, which we have next, and that's what we're going to move into right here, our listener Q&A. And again, I want to remind you, if you haven't yet, make sure you're subscribed to FloHockey, because I'm telling you right now, we watched some amazing college games already this year. We've got many more coming up this weekend. Then you've got pro hockey starting. You've already got junior hockey going. We've had some tremendous games at the Canadian Scholastic level. I mean, there's so many different levels of hockey. We've got, this last week, we've had 600 plus games on FloHockey. It's amazing. So before I start answering your questions, why don't you go ahead and, hop over to FloHockey.tv, grab a little, take a quick peek at the bank account, go for the subscription. I suggest the annual. I think it's the way to go, because you end up getting paying less per month, and then also you get all this great hockey. You don't have to worry about it for the rest of the season. So I think that's the way to go. There's going to be so many great things. If you like prospects, if you like pro hockey, if you like college hockey, we've got you covered. Make sure you check it out. All right, we're going to move into our question and answer, and our first one is about the 2024 NHL Draft, and this one comes from Jake. And Jake asks, what are your thoughts on Caleb Heil, and who is the top goalie prospect for the 2024 Draft? Really good question. In terms of, I want to answer the first part first, or the second part first, rather, about the 2024 NHL Draft, because as I've talked, I'm still obviously learning the class. It's early in the season. We're trying to find players that are kind of, taking a step, guys that are, playing very well. And so far, it's hard to really pick out the goalies that are going to stand out. But to answer Jake's question about the goalie that he did ask about, Caleb Heil, he's currently playing for the Sioux Falls Stampede, so you can obviously watch him on FloHockey. But he's appeared in 4 games so far, 3-1 record, and a 900 save percentage. He was the goalie for Team USA at the Hlinka Gretzky Cup. They won the bronze medal there. That doesn't happen very often. So it was a really good start to his season. So he's definitely, people are taking notice of him. They're watching him pretty carefully. He's playing in the USHL. He'll probably be more in a platoon role at Sioux Falls. But as he plays, he's going to be solid. He's committed to the University of North Dakota. He's, I think that there's definitely some tools there. He's got, being 6'2", I think that's what he's listed at. I think that being on that cusp of 6'1", 6'2" kind of thing, that's where NHL teams are, starting to get a little squirrely, which is funny because, we've obviously seen a number of guys that can do the job at a smaller size, but it is an issue. And Caleb Heil is a very intriguing prospect for the draft. I do believe he will be drafted. But, I think that it's still a bit early to tell when, what's ultimately going to happen in this class, because there are so few goalies that have really popped that we're paying super close attention to at this point. All right. Our next question comes from Mike Craddy, and he asks, tell me about Igor Chernyshov. Have seen some clips of him and am very intrigued. Well, Mike, you are not alone in that, because, I think anytime you have a Russian prospect that, is doing some really strong things at the KHL level, he hasn't necessarily produced at the KHL level, but he certainly is uniquely talented in terms of the skill level, in terms of the skating. I think that he's got size too, which is obviously always going to make a player even a little bit more attractive. I think if you look around the projections right now, a lot of people are putting him as a mid first round pick. I think as you look at kind of how Russian prospects are being handled, and that, you say, okay, well, what if he signs a longer term contract? We just saw Mikhail Gulayev, who was a first round pick of the Colorado Avalanche, sign an extension to play more years in the KHL. You don't have as much control over their development. So that's another factor. But I think Chernisov is the kind of guy that will garner a ton of interest. He did play some KHL games last year, did score a goal there. Didn't get a ton of minutes in the KHL when he has played this season. He's had a couple games where he was given, a regular shift, and so he'll bear watching. But in the U20 ranks, he's at nearly a point per game right now, and is scoring pretty regularly. So that's a player where I think that, he's definitely going to be a sought after prospect. I don't think he's the kind of prospect where you don't worry about the Russian factor as much, assuming that as you get more information, the player feels strongly that he wants to come to North America. I think in most cases, the Russian players do want to come over. They want to test themselves against the best players in the world. He's a late birth date from last year as well, which you do take into consideration in terms of, the different players and how they're playing this season, and comparing and contrasting them. But according to Elite Prospects, his contract is up in 2025. And whether or not that happens, we'll see. But he plays in the Dynamo Moscow program and system, so it's not, there's often those guys you kind of worry about certain clubs if they're going to stay there long term or if they're not going to develop. I think Moscow is typically, they're not going to have as many restraints on him developmentally as say St. Petersburg does on guys like Michkov, and they've obviously started to loan out a lot of their young players just because they seem not to trust their young guys that much. But very interesting prospect, one that I'm excited to follow more this year. Obviously that's a surface level kind of breakdown of him, but hopefully that'll be sufficient for now. And then obviously as the season goes on, we'll get more and more in depth on that. All right. Our next question comes from Evan, and he asks, when does Canada usually announce U17 rosters, and will Gavin McKenna make it? So this is in regards to the World Under 17 Hockey Challenge. And I appreciate the question because it's an event that I think is one of the great kind of touch points in a player's career very early on where we can start separating some of them a little bit. We saw last year James Higgins and Cole Eiserman absolutely torched that tournament. We've seen years where it was Alex Ovechkin torching that tournament. I remember seeing a 15-year-old Nathan McKinnon at that tournament back when I was working at USA Hockey, and just seeing this incredible talent that he was on. So the World Under 17 Hockey Challenge this year is an interesting event. It always is, because we get this look. The rosters typically will come out, I think, within the next couple of weeks here, because the tournament itself is not that far away. It's a very interesting tournament in terms of just what we learn. And this year they're going to have a number of really good. They have Sweden and they'll have Slovakia there this year, which is really fun to see. You have USA, and then you'll have multiple Canadian teams that will play as well. And so that's going to be another part that's a lot of fun. But the event itself starts on November 2nd with the pre-tournament games. And so then we should see rosters very soon. To answer your question specifically about Gavin McKenna, yes, he'll be on the team. No question about it. He's already off to a great start. He's a late 2007 birth date. And so that means that he's going to have to wait a little while to be drafted. Gavin McKenna currently playing for Medicine Hat Tigers. He is not eligible until the 2026 NHL Draft. He is currently at 14 points in 9 games with Medicine Hat in the WHL as a very young U17 player. And so he does not turn 16 until December 20th. So he will be a 15-year-old playing in this tournament with a very late birth date. So Gavin McKenna, I have no doubt in my mind, will be on the roster. As you know, the 07s are that's their age group. That's, you know, so he's young for the age group, but he's not an exceptional status player technically in the WHL. But I mean, this is a guy that is already doing some really special things at the junior level despite his youth. And so, yes, we will see him, and I think it'll be a great opportunity to see what he's all about. This U17 challenge is going to have a lot of really great players. LJ Mooney from the U.S. National Under 17 team will be there for the USA. I think Misa will be going back again. And so that's another guy who's not draft eligible until 2025. So I'm really excited to see what the U17 challenge brings along. And again, that starts November 2nd up in Canada. It is on, I believe it's in Prince Edward Island. Yes, it is indeed. So Prince Edward Island will get a great look at the future of hockey, and the teams that are participating. I misspoke earlier and said Slovakia. It's Czechia, Finland, Sweden, 2 Canadian teams, and then the United States. So that is who will be participating in the World Under-17 Hockey Challenge. All right, we got another prospect question. This one comes to us from Mike. And Mike asks, what are your projections for Roman Kantsarov? So we've got another question on a Russian player. And so that we will, again, we're still in the early stages of learning about players for this season, but Roman Kantsarov was drafted last year by the Chicago Blackhawks in the second round, 44th overall. And he's a bit of an undersized player, but incredibly electric in terms of his skills. And he is playing this season in the KHL, already has 5 points through 18 games with Metallurg. And he is a very intriguing prospect. Last year, he dominated the MHL. He had 54 points in 45 games. And he was one of those players that was really hard to kind of get a read on last season because you kind of expect him to dominate at the MHL level, even though he was younger, as just an 18-year-old at that point. He was a late 2004 birth date, and so he's pretty much in line with that. But to now see him take that next step forward, to see him go to the KHL and to be able to play a fairly regular shift at that level, kind of more of a third line role, that's a really positive thing. And so, what is his projection ultimately? I think the size factor is an issue. We'll have to see how soon he comes over to North America. As of right now, he's in the last year of his KHL contract. Does he extend? Does he do anything else like that? Because, the one thing that is difficult is to get Russian players to go into the AHL. And so that's something that, we'll have to wait and see. But Kantsarov, I think if he is going to make it, there's really a good potential for him to be a middle six scoring depth option. I don't think he's going to be a star player, but I do think he's going to be a very talented and potentially deadly offensive player. The question is going to be, how does he overtake that size? I think he's really competitive. I think he's got good skating ability, or good enough skating ability. And I think he thinks the game at a pretty high level. So that's a player that I could see being a middle six player at the NHL level. All right, we're moving on to another question from Murray. And Murray asks, why can't a CHL player like Matthew Poitras, or like the Matthew Poitras situation, play in the AHL? So Poitras is currently with the Boston Bruins. He is going to potentially stay with the Bruins. He's playing very well. I don't know that necessarily that they will send him back after his 9-game stint, or if they'll let him go longer than that, or if maybe he just stays the whole season. But the reason that he can't go to the AHL is because of his age. And there is the CHL AHL agreement or CHL NHL agreement, which basically stipulates, that any player before their age 19 season, or once they've played their age 19 season in the CHL, then they can go to the AHL. Until then, they can't. They have to go back to the CHL. It's part of the loan agreement that those two leagues have had. And there are a couple of reasons the NHL does this. This has been explained to me many times. I think there are definitely situations where it isn't harmful necessarily to the player, but where it isn't necessarily that helpful. I think there's a lot more players that are eligible, or would, if they were eligible, could compete in the AHL. But why do they send these players back? the main reason is to kind of try. There's a couple things. First of all, it's so that the star players stay in the CHL longer. It helps with ticket sales and all those other things. So that's one reason. But another reason is because you're also trying to protect the integrity of the competition level at the CHL. Having players like last year, Logan Stankoven, for example, playing in the CHL is good for his teammates. It's good for the guys that he plays against. It's something that is a teachable thing for coaches. Here's how you go against elite players. This is how you have to perform. So guys like Poitras, who are, 18 or 19 essentially, still have to go back to the junior ranks. And there's more language in there that's specific to the types of players. We did see that, Shane Wright, who technically fell just shy of the requirement of games to have had his whole season counted in the OHL, was granted the opportunity by all parties to go play in the AHL this year. So that's a little bit different. A guy like Poitras, if he's not playing on the NHL roster, he has to go back to the CHL. That's the key. And so if he starts struggling and things aren't going well, the Bruins probably owe it to him and to themselves, long term, to send him back and let him play junior hockey. So it's not ideal, but it is what it is. And that's the way it's going to stay. All right, our last question of the day comes from Pete, and he asks, has anyone correlated prospect success against tougher competition, high pressure with later career success, i.e. in the playoffs, international tournaments, Frozen Four, etc.? Does that tell us more in isolation than their overall body of work? Great question, and one that I think is very difficult to answer. The first thing I'll say is I don't know, and I haven't done it myself, to examine success at those tournaments and playoffs and how it translates. There have been plenty of players that had amazing World Junior Championships, amazing World Under 18 Championships, and didn't go on to great success. There have been plenty of players that have had great success in playoffs and didn't have any NHL success. What I think is important is that it is a very valuable piece of information, how a player plays in those events, how a player does when the stakes are higher, when the spotlight is brighter. All of that, I think, does get taken into account, but all is part of the bigger picture. We've seen guys like, let's say, Dennis Godla, who was an all-world goalie for one World Junior Championship. He never got an NHL deal, never really, he's been a European pro. That happens. There are guys that get hot at certain times, but that's why it's important to look at the entire body of work. If you look at the whole body of work and you make the most educated decision, that's not to say that teams won't weight the way a player plays at the World Juniors. I think you look at Nico Hischier. I think he was stapled to number one after his World Junior Championship. That's my opinion. I know that's not the case because there were teams that didn't have him number one. There were teams that say they had Cale Makar number one, and there were teams that may have had Nolan Patrick number one. But after that World Junior Championship, I think that was what sold a lot of people that Nico Hischier can be a big game player. So I'm not saying it doesn't sway things. It absolutely does. You look at Easton Cowan this last year. How he played for London in the playoffs in the OHL this year, in my mind, undoubtedly put him on a path to the first round in the eyes of the Maple Leafs that put him in the first round, because he was so good in the playoffs, and it was a great job by him to push things forward and to make a name for himself at the toughest time of the year. It's also the last impression that you make on the ice. So a lot of very interesting and intriguing things that kind of happen in those discussions, but that's certainly part of the discussion. Hey, he didn't play all that well at the World Juniors. Hey, he was stapled to the bench in the playoffs. Those different things, it all matters. And so it's interesting, Pete, maybe I'm going to have to go and do some more research now and see if we circle back to this one and see if we can find any correlation. But, there obviously, you look at kind of some of the guys that have been the best at the World Juniors. Who led the World Juniors in scoring last year? Connor Bedard. Who led it a couple years ago, led Team USA to a gold medal. Trevor Zegras, in the mix for gold medals and Calder trophies and everything else. Matty Beniers won a gold medal at the World Junior Championship, was a key player at that event. So there's a lot of things that happen there. So very fascinated to see exactly what all happens. And, I think that with these players, with these events, there are opportunities for players to stand up and to make a better case or a stronger case or strengthen their case to be an NHL player. So I don't think it's without merit that we look into those events and sometimes put a little more weight on them. But I do think that more information is always better than the small samples. All right, folks, that's going to do it for this week's episode of Talking Hockey Sense. Huge thanks to all of you that asked questions. Thanks to Justin Cohn for joining us. Thanks to Amanda for producing today. And thanks to all of you for listening. Don't forget, ECHL season begins on October 19th. Watch games throughout the entire weekend, including a free game on Facebook and YouTube. You'll see the Tulsa Oilers and the Utah Grizzlies go head-to-head on Sunday afternoon across FloHockey social media. And you'll also see a USHL game on Saturday night between the Lincoln Stars and the Sioux City Musketeers. So make sure you check those out as well and get a little bit of a free sample of FloHockey, if you will. And while you're there, go ahead and give us a follow across all social platforms. We're on TikTok, we're on Facebook, we're on Instagram, all that stuff. And always, please subscribe to this podcast, watch us on YouTube, watch us on FloHockey, and leave a kind rating and review on your podcast app of choice. That's going to do it for this week's episode. My name is Chris Peters. This is Talking Hockey Sense. We'll catch you next time.